In the dust-choked basements of forgotten archives, sealed folders marked with crimson ink still breathe the weight of silence. They carry the title that few dare to speak aloud. 4. WWII. Events too dark to be remembered. Each page, yellowed and brittle, bears the marks of secrecy. Blurred signatures, missing lines, entire paragraphs scorched black by censors who believed the truth too dangerous for public eyes. These were not the celebrated victories, nor the battles etched into marble monuments. Instead, these files reveal the operations that governments conspired to erase. Experiments on living bodies carried out in hidden laboratories, cities turned into furnaces by deliberate firestorms, refugees betrayed and handed over to certain death, and entire nations silenced by mass executions buried beneath lies. What unfolds here is not the war remembered in textbooks, but the shadows beneath it, where survival and power outweighed humanity. Each revelation is a fracture in the official record, a testimony to horrors that leaderships on every side sought to conceal. Tonight, as we break the seals and read aloud these forbidden lines, we step into a silence that was never meant to be broken, uncovering the weight of crimes written in ink, in blood, and in ash. This is not remembrance, it is exposure. Chapter 2. The Forbidden Bombing of Dresden. In February 1945, when the Second World War had already turned decisively against Hitler's Reich, an operation unfolded that remains one of the most disputed, most censored, and most disturbing episodes of the European theatre. The city was Dresden, a cultural jewel on the banks of the Elbe River, long celebrated for its Baroque architecture, art collections, and centuries of intellectual life. Unlike Berlin or Hamburg, Dresden held little in the way of armaments production. It had been spared the worst of the war's devastation, becoming instead a refuge for tens of thousands of civilians fleeing the advancing Red Army. Yet in the late hours of February 13th, and into the morning of February 14th, the city was transformed into a furnace. Under the codename Operation Thunderclap, British and American bombers converged with a mission that official documents claimed was military, but recently declassified fragments, stored in dusty RAF files and US Army Air Force memos, suggest that the intent was something darker, a psychological assault, a demonstration of overwhelming force designed to shatter not just German industry, but the German spirit. The first wave struck at 10:13 p.m. The Royal Air Force, under the direction of Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, known to his men and enemies alike as Bomber Harris, deployed over 240 Lancaster bombers. Their payload was incendiaries, thousands of them, mixed with high-explosive bombs designed to shatter roofs and open buildings for fire to take hold. The weather that night was cold and clear. Refugees had packed into the city, some sleeping in open squares, others in crowded basements. Within minutes, the sky glowed red. Eyewitnesses recalled fireballs leaping from one street to another, the roar of wind as oxygen was sucked from the air. Survivors described running through corridors of flame, their clothes igniting spontaneously, their lungs seared by air hot enough to melt metal. Children clutched to parents who collapsed mid-step, overcome by carbon monoxide. This was only the beginning. 3 hours later, while the city still burned, the second wave arrived. Again, RAF bombers descended, targeting not the military outskirts but the city's very heart. The Swinger Palace, the Frauenkirche, and entire neighborhoods that had survived centuries of history were obliterated in minutes. The firestorm became self-sustaining, generating winds of hurricane force, twisting tram rails like ribbons and consuming oxygen so quickly that many asphyxiated in basements sealed for safety. In the words of one survivor later interviewed by Allied interrogators, it was as if the air itself had been set alight. The third wave came in daylight. The US 8th Air Force, with over 300 flying fortresses, bombed what was left, dropping high explosives on rail stations, bridges, and whatever infrastructure still remained. By then, rescue crews were already digging through ruins. Thousands who had survived the night perished under the daylight bombardment. Officially, the justification for the raid was twofold: to disrupt rail lines moving German troops to the Eastern Front and to cripple the city's industrial capacity. Yet internal memoranda tell another story. In the weeks before the raid, British Air Ministry documents discussed the morale effects of destroying a cultural city. One memo, later marked classified, noted that targeting Dresden would show the Russians what Bomber Command can do. In other words, the raid was not only about Germany, it was also a signal to Stalin. As the Yalta Conference had just concluded days earlier with Allied leaders dividing Europe's fate, Dresden became a demonstration of Western air power to both an enemy and a soon-to-be rival. Civilians, in this calculus, were collateral, or worse, deliberate victims of psychological warfare. The death toll has never been firmly established. Nazi propaganda at the time claimed over 200,000 dead, figures later dismissed as exaggeration. Allied estimates settled on approximately 25,000 to 35,000, though some researchers, examining burial records and missing persons reports, argue that the number could be far higher. What complicates the truth is the deliberate obfuscation that followed. Immediately after the raid, Allied intelligence ordered strict controls on photography and press releases. Images that leaked, bodies lined along streets, charred corpses unrecognizable as human, were classified, hidden in war archives, or released in limited, heavily censored form. Dresden was to be remembered not as a crime, but as a necessity, folded neatly into the narrative of final victory over the Reich. Yet whispers persisted. American officers on the ground filed quiet reports, noting the overwhelming civilian presence in the city. British MPs raised concerns in the House of Commons, only to be silenced with appeals to wartime unity. Even Winston Churchill, who initially supported the bombing campaign, later distanced himself from Dresden in a memo dated March 28, 1945, describing the raid as a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing. That memo was quickly buried in the National Archives, its language softened in official records. Bomber Harris, for his part, never expressed regret. To him, Dresden was simply one more city in a war where total destruction had become routine. After the war, Dresden became a symbol manipulated by both sides of the Cold War. In East Germany, the communist government memorialized the bombing as proof of Western barbarity, erecting monuments and holding ceremonies that cast the city as a martyr to capitalist aggression. In the West, the subject was largely avoided. Historians who pressed too far into Dresden's archives found documents missing or sealed for decades. US Army Air. Force records referencing psychological objectives were quietly declassified only in the late 20th century, long after those responsible had passed away. What emerges from these fragments is the image of an operation that was not simply military, but demonstrative. An act intended to terrify, to send messages across borders, and to erase a city's cultural soul. For the survivors, Dresden never ended. Families who fled into basements returned to find their homes reduced to ash. Hospitals overflowed with the burned and suffocated. Doctors amputating limbs without anesthesia, using whatever tools could be salvaged from rubble. Refugees who had escaped the Red Army only to die in Dresden were never counted in official tallies, their names lost among mass graves where bodies were cremated en masse to prevent disease. The Frauenkirche, the city's iconic church, collapsed into ruins that would stand as a scar until German reunification decades later. For generations, Dresden carried its trauma in silence, its survivors' voices muted by the politics of memory and the uneasy guilt of victors who did not wish to admit what had been done. Today, when declassified files are examined, Dresden emerges not only as a tragedy, but as a forbidden subject. To acknowledge it fully would be to question the moral foundations of Allied victory, to admit that in the pursuit of total war, the line between justice and atrocity was blurred beyond recognition. The bombing of Dresden was more than a military strike. It was the deliberate annihilation of a city, an act justified on paper but carried out in flames, hidden beneath victory speeches and Cold War narratives. Dresden remains one of the darkest shadows of World War II, a firestorm carefully obscured, too disturbing to be remembered and too politically dangerous to confront in full. Chapter 1. The Classified Atrocity of Unit 731. In the heart of occupied Manchuria, on the outskirts of the quiet town of Pingfang, stood a sprawling complex of brick buildings and barbed wire. To the outside world, it was disguised as a water purification and epidemic prevention facility. To those who were forced through its gates, it was a chamber of nightmares. The year was 1936, when Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a rising star in the Imperial Japanese Army, was given full authority to establish a secret program under the Kwantung Army. The codename, Unit 731. On official paper, it was a research division for combating disease and ensuring soldier survival. In reality, it was an epicenter of biological warfare experimentation, where human beings were reduced to code names, labeled Maruta, meaning logs, disposable, replaceable, and destined for annihilation. Inside those walls, entire wings of the complex were dedicated to human experimentation, under conditions that defied comprehension. Men, women, and children, often Chinese civilians, but also Russian prisoners of war, Mongols, and even a handful of Allied captives, were shackled and subjected to grotesque trials. Prisoners were deliberately infected with anthrax, plague, cholera, and typhoid, their symptoms meticulously documented in lab notebooks with cold precision. Some were locked in pressure chambers until their eyes burst from their sockets. Others were exposed to frostbite tests, their limbs frozen and thawed repeatedly to study the progression of gangrene. Vivisections, surgical dissections conducted on living subjects without anesthesia, were routine. Doctors in military uniforms calmly recorded the failure of organs, the collapse of lungs, the spread of sepsis, while the victims screamed in unison with the steel scraping their bones. The data was invaluable to the Imperial Army. Ishii and his subordinates prepared elaborate proposals for battlefield deployment. Test bombs filled with plague-infected fleas were dropped over Chinese villages, producing localized epidemics that killed thousands. Reports declassified decades later revealed that in 1940, field experiments were carried out in Ningbo, where cholera and typhoid were released, leading to mass civilian deaths. Survivors described entire rivers contaminated, food stores poisoned, and wells seeded with bacteria. These operations were not accidents of war, but deliberate acts of biological aggression, calculated and documented with military precision. Unit 731 became a factory of both suffering and knowledge, producing results that the Japanese High Command considered critical for its grand strategy in Asia. As the war dragged on, Ishii's work intensified. His researchers perfected ceramic bombs capable of dispersing fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium. Reports hinted at plans for large-scale attacks on US cities, including San Diego, in a scheme known as Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. By 1945, had Japan's war machine not collapsed, thousands of civilians on American soil might have been subjected to outbreaks designed by Unit 731's laboratories. Yet the end of the war did not bring justice for the victims of Pingfang. Instead, their suffering became a bargaining chip in the new geopolitical struggle of the Cold War. When the Soviet Red Army advanced into Manchuria in August 1945, Ishii ordered the destruction of the complex. Prisoners were executed, laboratories burned, evidence torched. Yet traces remained, mass graves filled with twisted corpses, glass jars containing preserved human remains, abandoned instruments still stained with blood. Soviet forces captured surviving staff and later presented evidence of the atrocities at the 1949 Khabarovsk war crimes trials. Witnesses described procedures in chilling detail, naming doctors who had operated on men without anesthesia and officers who had overseen plague bomb dispersals. The transcripts, though available, were dismissed by the Western world as Soviet propaganda, buried under the tension of post-war mistrust. What truly sealed Unit 731's silence, however, was a decision made not in Tokyo or Moscow, but in Washington. US intelligence officers, particularly under the umbrella of the War Department and later the CIA, recognized the strategic value of Ishii's research. Operation Paperclip, the program known for recruiting German scientists, had a parallel in the Pacific. Instead of prosecution, Ishii and his senior officers were offered immunity. In exchange, they handed over their records, complete datasets of human experimentation unavailable anywhere else in the world. Memos from General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters, declassified decades later, confirmed that US authorities shielded these men from war crimes trials, even as evidence of their atrocities lay in plain sight. The victims of Pingfang were erased, their suffering converted into files stored deep within American laboratories, their identities dissolved into data points. Meanwhile, the Soviets pursued their own path. Having extracted testimony from captured staff, they launched biological weapons programs of their own. Analysts believe that the seeds of the Soviet biowarfare capabilities during the Cold War can be traced directly back to intelligence gained from Unit 731. In this way, The legacy of Pingfang stretched far beyond Manchuria, influencing a global arms race fought not with tanks or planes, but with pathogens invisible to the naked eye. For decades, silence covered the atrocity. In Japan, official denial remained strong. Survivors who dared to speak were silenced or ignored. Families of victims who attempted to sue for recognition were met with bureaucratic walls. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s that Japanese journalists and historians, digging through archives and interviewing former soldiers, began piecing together the truth. Yet even then, many documents remained classified, shredded, or conveniently misplaced. The memory of Unit 731's crimes exists today only through fragments, grainy photographs of emaciated prisoners, surviving testimonies of soldiers who could no longer bear their guilt, and the scarred memories of Chinese families who watched their villages die under invisible plagues. The story of Unit 731 is not one of aberration, but of calculated policy. It demonstrates how, in the pursuit of power, a state can dismantle the boundary between science and atrocity. The men in white coats were not fringe madmen, but decorated officers of the Imperial Army, rewarded for their cruelty and protected in its aftermath. Their victims remain nameless to history, reduced to logs in notebooks exchanged for immunity. It is a silence that lingers like a contagion, reminding us that beneath every war's official narrative, there exists another layer, darker, forbidden, and written in human suffering that was never meant to be remembered. Today, the ruins of Pingfang are a museum. Tourists walk through halls once drenched in screams, past displays of instruments and faded uniforms. The soil outside still conceals fragments of bone, yet the archives remain incomplete, and the complicity of nations in burying the truth continues to cloud full accountability. As declassified documents trickle out, we are left with a haunting realization. The worst atrocities of Unit 731 were not just committed in the shadows of war, but perpetuated in the silence that followed. This file, labeled classified for decades, now reads as a warning, a reminder of the price paid when knowledge is valued above humanity, and when crimes too dark to be remembered are instead used to shape the future. Chapter 3: Hidden Secrets of Operation Keelhaul. As the war in Europe drew to a close in May 1945, Allied forces celebrated victory over Nazi Germany. But behind the parades and the triumphal headlines, another story was unfolding. One that was deliberately hidden from public knowledge for decades. It was known only by a code name whispered in hushed corridors, Operation Keelhaul. To the soldiers on the ground, it seemed routine, the movement of displaced persons, prisoners of war, and refugees across shifting borders. But for those who lived through it, Keelhaul was a betrayal written in blood and silence. Millions of men, women, and children who had fled westward to escape Stalin's regime suddenly found themselves caught in a secret pact between the Allied powers and the Soviet Union. They were handed over at gunpoint to the NKVD, Stalin's feared secret police, and transported to a fate far worse than exile. For many, it meant immediate execution. For others, it meant years, or lifetimes, in the Siberian gulags. The origins of Operation Keelhaul can be traced back to the Yalta Conference in February 1945. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met to carve up the post-war world. Amid the grand discussions of Germany's occupation zones and the founding of the United Nations, there were quieter agreements, scribbled in memoranda and tucked away in classified appendices. One such agreement stipulated that all Soviet citizens liberated or captured in Europe would be repatriated to the USSR, regardless of their wishes. Stalin demanded it, framing it as a matter of national honor and post-war stability. Roosevelt and Churchill, needing Stalin's cooperation against Japan and fearful of fracturing the alliance before Berlin fell, agreed. What they knew, and what they concealed, was that for millions who had fled Stalin's regime, repatriation meant death. In practice, Operation Keelhaul began in the summer of 1945, as Allied forces took control of prisoner of war camps and displaced persons camps scattered across Italy, Austria, and Germany. Among those targeted were Cossacks who had fought against the Bolsheviks since the Russian Civil War, white Russian immigrants who had fled in the 1920s, and Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians who feared Soviet domination. Even those who had been forced into German labor battalions or conscripted into German military service against their will were not spared. Allied officers received coded orders. All Soviet nationals were to be handed over. Some soldiers obeyed without question. Others recoiled, but were threatened with court-martial if they resisted. The scenes that followed were harrowing. In May 1945, near Lienz in Austria, British troops surrounded a camp of Cossack families who had surrendered peacefully, believing they would be allowed to resettle in the West. Instead, under deception, they were told they were being taken for a routine conference. When they arrived at the handover site, NKVD trucks waited. Eyewitness accounts describe mothers clinging to their children, priests chanting prayers, and men slitting their own throats rather than face return to Stalin's justice. British soldiers, some in tears, were ordered to drive them forward with bayonets. One officer later confessed in a private diary, "It was not war, it was murder." Similar scenes repeated across Europe, in Judenburg, in Bleiburg, at border crossings where Allied jeeps escorted columns of refugees directly into Soviet custody. The operation was meticulously organized. Files recovered from the British National Archives reveal logistics plans marked "most secret." Trains were scheduled with military precision, guarded by Allied MPs to prevent escapes. Intercepted communications suggest that NKVD officers prepared execution lists in advance, singling out officers, clergy, and intellectuals for immediate liquidation. The rest were packed into cattle cars bound for Siberia. Many never arrived, dying of starvation and disease along the way. Those who survived found themselves in the labyrinth of the Gulag. Forced labor camps spread across the Arctic, where temperatures plunged to -40 degrees, and survival was measured in weeks. Soviet reports, unearthed after 1991, suggest that less than a quarter of those repatriated under Operation Keelhaul lived more than 5 years. The Western powers concealed their role. Official communiqué described the transfers as voluntary repatriations. Press coverage was suppressed, and reporters who pried too closely found their access revoked. In Washington, the State Department labeled the matter classified, citing delicate relations with our Soviet allies. In London, Churchill's cabinet papers avoided the word forced, referring instead to movements of displaced Soviet nationals. Yet soldiers knew the truth. Letters smuggled home from camps described children screaming as they were dragged into Soviet trucks, mothers beaten unconscious when they resisted. Many of these letters were censored, but a handful survived, later forming part of the evidence when historians finally uncovered the operation decades later. One of the darkest chapters of Keelhaul involved the betrayal of General Andrei Shkuro and other senior White Russian officers who had fought alongside German forces in a desperate bid to free their homeland from Stalin. Despite explicit promises of asylum, they were handed over in May 1945. Within weeks, they were executed in Moscow's Butyrka prison. Their deaths were never reported in Allied records. Their names vanished into Soviet silence. The betrayal echoed through émigré communities for generations, a reminder that political expediency had triumphed over human lives. The secrecy surrounding Operation Keelhaul lasted well into the Cold War. With East-West tensions rising, neither Washington nor London wished to draw attention to their complicity in Stalin's purges. Documents remained classified until the 1970s, when researchers like Julius Epstein, a German-born historian, uncovered fragments in the US National Archives. His work revealed the scale of the betrayal and sparked outrage among surviving refugees. Lawsuits were filed, but courts dismissed them, citing government immunity and the political nature of the decisions. In Britain, Parliament avoided debate, labelling the issue closed. For survivors, silence was a second wound. Families were destroyed not just by the handover, but by the erasure of their suffering from history's record. Today, the term keelhaul remains largely unknown outside specialist circles. In military jargon, keelhauling was an ancient naval punishment, dragging a sailor beneath the keel of a ship until he drowned. The codename was not accidental. It symbolized a death sentence disguised as procedure. For those betrayed under its shadow, it was exactly that. A drowning of lives beneath the keel of Allied victory, their suffering hidden in the currents of political necessity. The graves left behind, in Siberia, in border fields, in unmarked pits across Eastern Europe, a silent testimony to the cost of compromise. The story of Operation Keelhaul forces a reckoning with uncomfortable truths. It was not committed by the Axis, but by the very powers that claimed to fight for freedom. It was not an accident of war, but a calculated policy carried out under orders signed by men hailed as liberators. And it was not remembered because to remember it would have meant acknowledging that victory in 1945 was stained with betrayal. Even now, many files remain redacted. Pages are missing, names blacked out, entire sections excised from the record. What remains is a patchwork, pieced together from survivor testimonies, declassified fragments, and the ruins of camps where families vanished. Operation Keelhaul stands as one of the most disturbing cover-ups of the 20th century. A hidden genocide of the displaced, executed under the banner of Allied authority, and too dark for public remembrance. Chapter 4. The Erased Massacre at Katyn Forest. In the spring of 1940, while Europe's attention was fixed on Hitler's advances in the West, deep in the forests of Western Russia, a secret massacre unfolded that would scar the conscience of nations. The location was Katyn, a wooded area near Smolensk. The perpetrators were not the Nazis, though later they would be blamed. The killers were the Soviet NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, operating under the personal orders of Lavrenti Beria and ultimately Joseph Stalin himself. Their victims were not enemy soldiers in battle, but prisoners of war, 22,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, doctors, priests, and political leaders, the very fabric of Poland's educated elite. They had been captured in 1939 after the Red Army's invasion of eastern Poland under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Initially interned in camps at Kozelsk, Ostashkov, and Starobelsk, they were promised eventual release. Instead, in March 1940, a Politburo decision marked top secret sealed their fate. The files, declassified only in 1992, contained Stalin's own signature. The killings were systematic, executed with cold precision. Prisoners were transported in groups, often at night, their hands bound, their personal belongings catalogued and confiscated. At Katyn, they were led into a clearing, one by one, and shot in the back of the head with pistols, usually German-made Walther PPKs, deliberately chosen to create confusion about responsibility. Their bodies were dumped into mass graves, layered with earth and lime. The executions continued for weeks, not only in Katyn, but also in Kalinin, now Tver, and Kharkiv, where similar pits swallowed the educated elite of Poland. Families back home received no word. Letters stopped. Silence replaced hope. The crime remained hidden until 1943, when German forces, having advanced into Soviet territory, uncovered the graves at Katyn. They invited international medical commissions, including representatives of the Red Cross, to examine the bodies. The evidence was overwhelming. The prisoners had been executed in 1940 when the region was under Soviet control. The Nazis exploited the discovery for propaganda, hoping to drive a wedge between the Allies. The Soviet Union, in turn, denied everything, insisting that the massacre had been carried out by the Wehrmacht in 1941. Moscow staged its own investigations, producing falsified reports and witnesses, coerced into testifying against the Germans. For the rest of the war, the official Soviet line was accepted by necessity. The Western Allies, aware of the truth through decrypted intelligence and diplomatic cables, chose silence. Churchill, in a private letter, admitted that the Soviets were likely guilty, but instructed his government to avoid public confrontation. Roosevelt, when pressed by the Polish government in exile, dismissed the matter, unwilling to jeopardize cooperation with Stalin against Hitler. The silence did not end with the war. At the Nuremberg trials in 1946, Soviet prosecutors attempted to charge the Germans with the Katyn massacre. The Western judges, uncomfortable with the evidence, allowed the claim to be dropped quietly, avoiding a direct clash with Moscow. For the families of the victims, this was another betrayal. For decades, they were told their fathers, brothers, and sons had been killed by the Nazis, even as they carried private doubts. The Polish diaspora in London and elsewhere kept the memory alive, publishing testimonies and collecting evidence, but their voices were dismissed as politically motivated. In Poland itself, now a Soviet satellite state, even speaking of Katyn as a Soviet crime was punishable by imprisonment. The massacre became a forbidden subject, erased from textbooks, excluded from public memorials, silenced in official discourse. Yet fragments of truth persisted. In the 1950s, the US Congress conducted hearings into the Katyn massacre, concluding that the Soviets were responsible. But these findings, too, were muted in the interests of Cold War diplomacy. Only after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 did the archives finally open. In October 1992, Russian President Boris Yeltsin released secret documents, including Beria's memo to Stalin recommending execution. and the Politburo's signed order. These documents confirmed what survivors' families had always known, that the massacre was a deliberate act of Soviet policy designed to eliminate Poland's leadership class and cripple its resistance to post-war domination. The consequences of Katyn were far-reaching. By decapitating Poland's elite, the Soviets ensured that the country could be reshaped according to Moscow's design in the post-war years. The Polish intelligentsia, the officers who might have led resistance to communism, lay in shallow graves. For decades, this absence was felt in the nation's cultural and political life. The wound deepened with the enforced lie. Generations of Poles forced to repeat in schools and in public that it was the Germans who had murdered their countrymen, even as private memory contradicted the official script. Today, Katyn remains a symbol of both atrocity and erasure. Monuments now stand at the sites of the killings, and commemorations are held openly. Yet the archives remain incomplete. Many files are still classified, their contents unknown. Historians suspect that detailed lists of perpetrators, correspondence about international cover-ups, and reports on similar massacres elsewhere are still hidden in Russia's vaults. In 2010, another tragedy struck. A Polish government plane carrying officials en route to a Katyn commemoration crashed near Smolensk, killing all aboard, including the President of Poland. The event reignited debates, suspicion, and the sense that Katyn's curse had not yet lifted. The erased massacre at Katyn Forest is more than a historical crime. It is a lesson in the power of silence, in how truth can be buried not just beneath soil, but beneath decades of political calculation. It reveals how governments, even in alliance, can collude in suppression, sacrificing justice for expedience. For the victims, the officers executed with a single bullet, their names scratched into hidden lists, recognition came too late. Their story, censored for half a century, stands as one of the darkest files of the Second World War, a forbidden memory, resurfacing only when the empire that concealed it finally collapsed. And even now, with fragments revealed, the full record of Katyn remains elusive, locked away, as if too dark to ever be remembered in its entirety. The files we have opened close, not with resolution, but with echoes. 4. Events, too dark to be remembered, are not simply shadows of the past. They are warnings etched in secrecy, reminders of how easily nations rewrite history when the truth is inconvenient. In Manchuria, the laboratories of Unit 731 turned human beings into experiments, and their suffering was erased with signatures of immunity. In Dresden, fire consumed a city, while official records cloaked it as military necessity, concealing the reality of deliberate cultural annihilation. In the valleys of Austria and the camps of Germany, Operation Keelhaul delivered the displaced into the jaws of execution, disguised as diplomacy, hidden under classified seals. And in Katyn, the silence of governments ensured that families mourned in ignorance for half a century, their loved ones denied even the dignity of truth. Each event is bound not only by atrocity, but by suppression, proof that wars are not only fought with weapons, but with archives, lies, and withheld documents. What remains unanswered is how many more such files still lie locked, how many more pages remain blackened, waiting to be unearthed. These stories remind us that remembrance is fragile, and that even the victors of history conceal crimes too dangerous to acknowledge. The question lingers: what else has been buried, marked classified, waiting for someone to read it aloud?